I'm Teresa Caraggio, and this is Third Paradigm. Today I am asking, was Hitler a Rothschild? And I will be taking a very deep dive into the lineage and character of Hitler's father, Alois. At the end, I'll be doing my best guess as to whether Alois was Rothschild's son, and therefore Adolf his grandson. And with that, I'll be using my own intuition to say whether I think that Adolf was, 1, an intentional and knowingly a Rothschild agent, 2, unwittingly a Rothschild puppet through manipulation or blackmail, and 3, whether Germany was simply outdone in terms of military and economic might. This was instigated by Julius Schoolafish, my best-read reader on Hitler. He wrote in response to the last episode, "Once again, where we disagree. No, Hitler was not a Rothschild-controlled agent, and no, Hitler did not create Israel." And then he attached a genealogy of Hitler, and that's what I'll be going into, and also some ancient maps, including one from 47 Common Era. And that shows that there is no Israel. There is Palestine by the sea, and then Judea above it. So that deserves an episode all on its own. I responded to Julius that this disagreement between us is so important for us to have, because look at the places where we agree. On the integrity and intelligence of the German people, and I have attached a video he sent that is the 10 Commandments of the German soldier at war. And then on the soundness of sovereign money, according to the Gottfried Feder plan. If we look at this as a question of whether Hitler was controlled by Rothschild, it sidesteps the entire Holocaust narrative, because what it says is that if there was a Holocaust, then Rothschild and his minions, the Ashkenazis, are the ones who did it. So that is an important discussion to have, because it turns everything into a different direction. It's not the German people versus the Allies or Hitler versus Churchill. Instead, it makes the world wars, both of them, Rothschild against Germany. And Rothschild won. But won through deception, potentially. Maybe Germany was just outgunned and there was nothing they could do, which would be maybe the same situation we're in right now. But maybe both sides had good people in them who had been undermined through a deception that is going on even today. In that case, revealing the deception is what we need to do. As I quoted from Cicero in the last episode, a nation can survive its fools and even the ambitious, but it cannot survive treason from within. Julius and I are on the same side, and he had a brilliant statement that I will quote. Appeasement is another of those weaponized words. A positive thing turned into something negative by inference. It should actually read appeasement, as it is now well documented that Hitler made countless pleas for peace, while world Jewry and their puppets were never going to allow peace to break out. And I can't actually think of a decade, year, or moment since World War II that the world has enjoyed actual peace. It should be pointed out that world Jewry is how that group referred to themselves, as the Jewish global nation. And that's an important concept, because what we're looking at is an empire that is a diaspora, that this is having traders who are loyal to a different country than the one that they're in. And that's the formula that I think we need to be looking at and figuring out whether that was how Germany was taken down. Julius and I are also in agreement that history has been falsified for a very long time. Coincidentally, I also got an article last week from the Phoenician Hunter, and he quoted, "In 1904, just over 120 years ago, the New York Times published a short article titled The Abolition of History, dedicated to the posthumous publication of the book The Rise of English Culture by Edwin Johnson. Johnson discovered that in the late Middle Ages, the whole of Christian literature and much of European history was manufactured by a literary confederacy composed of the Basilian and Benedictine monks, and was antedated into times when it could not have been written. Of Johnson, the reviewer wrote, 'It is modern history which he has on the brain, and he knows that this subject cannot be understood without attention to the Benedictine system. That system, as he explains it, is of a band of dishonest fabulists, organized and disciplined in the use of the pen, taught to agree upon a dogma and a fable. From their hands came the whole of our Christian literature, the whole of our history, arranged to suit their purposes.' In Anno Domini, a book that changed forever my thinking about time, Laurent Guillenot looks at the first millennium as a chronological invention. By whom? He writes, 'There is no question that the greatest forgers of history were churchmen. It is no exaggeration that European history was, to a large extent, shaped by a single papal forgery. This is the donation of Constantine that conferred on the Pope the full extent of imperial authority, the right to give it or take it away from emperors, or to rule as emperors in their place, and I will link my episode on that at the end. Coincidentally, the genealogy that Julius sent also looks at the falsification of history by the Church. Alfred Conder begins with his preface. Back in the 11th century, Pope Gregory VII occasionally found himself fettered by the lack of documentation for his papal decrees. Pope Gregory solved his problem by forgery. In his controversial book, Vicars of Christ, Peter de Rosa writes that Pope Gregory had a whole school of forgers under his very nose, turning out document after document with the papal seal of approval to cater for his every need. De Rosa comments, "This instant method of inventing history was marvelously successful." Gratian, the famous 12th century Benedictine monk, is remembered in Christian church history for writing the Decretium, or Code of Canon Law. There was only one problem with the work. It was, as Peter de Rosa notes, peppered with 3 centuries of forgeries and conclusions drawn upon them, with his own fictional additions. Of the 324 passages he quotes from popes of the first 4 centuries, only 11 are genuine. Conder then quotes from the 1955 Secret of the Hittites on how the spirit of the age or political correctness often rules historians. I've ordered that book because that's exactly what I'm researching on Oh My Goddess, the Aryan-ruled war tribes who destroyed the goddess cultures. And a key one of those was the Hittites. So I've wondered whether there was an occult meaning to having that be the name rather than Heidler, which was the name that was taken as the father of Alois Schicklgruber using his mother's maiden name. Conder's right that 100 years ago the spelling of names were not fixed, but he goes through the genealogy And there are Hitlers and Heidlers, but there is nothing that's really close to a Hitler. Here's the immediate connection, and readers will know that Alois, Hitler's father, was born a bastard, to use that technical term. So here is the family that he ends up becoming part of. George Heidler was the third of 6 sons, but his father Martin left the estate to the 5th, Lorenz, who sold it to the youngest brother, Nepomuk. So Lorenz and Nepomuk start by cheating the oldest son out of his inheritance, and Nepomuk, despite being the youngest, has money from somewhere. Keep your eye on Nepomuk. Condor writes, "It is reasonable to assume that work brought George Heidler to the tiny farming village of Strones sometime before the fall of 1836, for it was at that time he met and began a relationship with Maria Anna Schicklgruber, something that wasn't too difficult, since he was likely living with her father, Johann Schicklgruber, at number 22 in Strones, where the unmarried Maria Anna also resided. Shortly after this, Maria Anna conceived a baby by George Heidler, which at once turns our attention towards her father." This paragraph contains 3 speculations with no evidence. It continues into imaginary terrain on why her father would allow this and how common law marriage was a normal thing, so normal that she stayed with friends when she had the baby, and never lists George as the father on the birth certificate. Instead, Alois is listed as illegitimate and given her name. That makes no sense in a common law marriage. Now let's look at Adolf's grandmother, Maria. Maria's mother dies when she's 27 and she receives a small inheritance. She saves it in the orphans' fund until Alois is born 15 years later, by which time it's doubled. She lives with a German family at the time he's born, Johann and Johanna Trümmerschlager, who she names as the godparents. Only after that does she go to live with her father, Johannes Schicklgruber, and after an indeterminate time, they're joined by Johann George Heidler. Hans Frank is the person that Adolf Hitler put in charge of investigating his genealogy when a nephew tried to blackmail him with information on him having Jewish ancestors. So from his prison cell at Nuremberg, Hans Frank wrote in his memoirs about the evidence for this. What he said is that Maria Schicklgruber and George Heidler were second cousins. So I looked at the great-grandparents, and I go through this in the Substack article, and looked for any common names. I found many common first names. Johanns and Teresias are abundant, but I couldn't find any common last names. And so unless Hans Frank knew something that he wasn't disclosing, there are no second cousins on George and Maria, or any reason that they would have been in touch before she got pregnant. When baby Alois is 5 and George Heidler is 50 and Maria is 47, they get married and he makes Alois his stepson. At that point, he's living with the Schicklgrubers as a journeyman miller. But he doesn't give Alois his last name, which again makes no sense if he's actually the father. Condor writes, "It is said that when Johann George and Maria Anna married, they were so poor that George made their wedding bed out of an old cattle trough. Indeed, poverty may well have been the reason for George and Maria Ann Heidler's delayed marriage in the first place, since a marriage ceremony was not a free service of the church. Poverty undoubtedly played a major role in George and Maria Anna Heidler's decision to send their young son to Spittal to live with George's younger brother, Johann Nepomuk Heidler. A contributing factor in the decision was likely Maria Anna Heidler's declining health as she was suffering from tuberculosis. This seems a messianic allusion to Alois being practically born in a manger. But that contradicts what Wikipedia says on Maria and that inheritance. By the time it doubled, it was worth 165 gulden, which could buy a third of an inn. One source says she was a thrifty, reserved, and exceptionally shrewd peasant woman. I think he could have left it at thrifty and reserved. She would have been quite a catch for a journeyman miller. Maria dies when Alois is 9. Instead of staying with his stepfather, George, he's sent to the younger brother's house, Nepomuk, who now has 3 children, and he is a prosperous farmer on that stolen inheritance. The oldest, Johanna, is 17 at the time. She would later marry Johann Baptist Polzel and become Alois's 3rd mother-in-law. Why is everyone named some version of Johann? There is speculation that Alois was Nepomuk's son from an affair that he had with Maria just after his 3rd child was born. Affair, like common law marriage, mistress, and womanizing, should be translated as rape when the woman has the status of a servant, especially in a household with no mother. This would not be out of character for Nepomuk the opportunist. But did he have the opportunity? There's no evidence of a prior relationship before Alois is born, and Maria was devoutly Catholic, making it unlikely she'd have an affair with a married man unless forced. Condor assures us that the bastard son Alois was lavished with tender loving care in Nepomuk's home by the wife on whom he may have cheated. All their living children were daughters and therefore worthless. Condor says Nepomuk's devotion to Alois is proof that George was his father and Nepomuk cared for his son out of fraternal love for the brother he'd cheated out of the farm. What we know for certain Nepomuk cares about is money. So let's trace that. Hans Frank wrote that Maria Schicklgruber had worked as a cook for a well-to-do Jewish family named Frankenberger, living in Grau when she'd become pregnant. They had a 19-year-old son. Frank had been given from Adolf many letters that they had exchanged, which seemed to him evidence of a cordial relationship. The Jewish family paid for the support of Alois up until the time he was 14 years old. Frank wrote that the money was given to avoid a public scandal, implying that Maria had threatened to bring a suit against the Frankenbergers. Those letters would have still existed and could be produced. By this account, Alois has a stipend coming in for his care. Nepomuk could get any inheritance Alois had from Maria and the stipend by taking in the orphan bastard. A single source, which has been quoted widely, says there were no Frankenbergers or even any Jews in Grau at that time, where Maria was said to live. But there's also no record of where she went between the age of 27 when her mother died and 42 when she had Alois. Any family that can fabricate the whole of Christian literature and much of English history can come up with a fake identity named for Frankfurt, where the Rothschilds started their dynasty. At 13, Alois left this loving household where he lived with 3 teenage girls to strike out on his own for Vienna. There, he purportedly worked as an apprentice cobbler for 5 years, a skill he never used. In 1855, at 18 years old, he snagged a job as a customs official or Austrian frontier guard. He was so proud of this that he wore his uniform after retirement and insisted on being addressed as Herr Oberoffizier Hitler. And the photographs you should really check out, and they're at thirdparadigm.substack.com. When Alois is 20 years old, his stepfather George dies, and remember, he hasn't lived with George since he was 9 years old. When Alois is 32, he impregnates a 25-year-old girl who then goes on to have a baby named Teresia with her last name Pence, since he doesn't marry her. Instead, 4 years later, he marries a wealthy 50-year-old named Anna, and she is the daughter of another customs official. Soon after their marriage, he starts an affair with Franny Matzelberger, a servant at the Palmer Inn, where he and Anna rent the top floor. Now, at the time that they get married, Anna and Alois, Franny would have been 12. So this is not an affair, this is statutory rape. Then his career promotions stall, maybe from lack of education, or maybe his father-in-law disapproves of Alois's numerous affairs. Maybe it rankled Alois that he shared the status of illegitimate with his daughter Teresia, because the next year saw big changes according to Condor. Historian Werner Maser claims that in 1876, Franz Schicklgruber, the administrator of Alois's mother's estate and also an uncle of Alois, transferred a large sum of money, 230 gulden. Supposedly, Johann Georg Heidler, who died in 1857, relented on his deathbed and left an inheritance to his illegitimate stepson, together with his surname. It isn't logical that Maria dies in 1847, George dies in 1857, but Franz Schicklgruber doesn't transfer this large sum of money until 1876. So Alois is already 39 years old, married to a wealthy woman, and established in his career. This is enough to buy half of an inn. Would that be comparable to $1 million today? That is the same year, and maybe the same time, when Alois goes with Nepomuk and 2 other relatives who swear before the parish priest that George was Alois's biological father and had expressed the desire to legitimize him during his life, but somehow never got around to it. The priest writes in George as father on the baptismal registry, and Alois changes his name to Hitler, not Heidler. 2 things are clear. Nepomuk and Alois are both schemers, out for a quick buck and a quick fuck. They would sell their mother's soul and already did. The name Schicklgruber has been said to mean Sheckelgruber or money grubber, but that seems to define Nepomuk more than Maria. The other thing that's clear is that Nepomuk knows the real father of Alois, especially if it's someone who can be squeezed for money. It's certainly not George, who was only named as father after he was dead and couldn't object. What was the real purpose of the 5 years that Alois spent in Vienna, just when the stipend for his support ends? And who got that stipend for the 5 years after Maria died? Let's look at the description for one of the 5 palaces owned by the Rothschilds in Vienna. Palace Rothschild Teresia Numgasa, Vienna. The Palace Nathaniel Rothschild was a palatial house in Vienna, one of 5 Palace Rothschilds in the city owned by members of the Rothschild banking family of Austria. So that's ambiguous whether it indicates 5 palaces owned by the Rothschilds or that the city of Vienna is owned by the Rothschilds. And curious that the name of the street has Teresia in it, same as Maria's father's mother, with either no maiden name or the same last name as her father's father, Maria's mother's mother, and Alois's bastard daughter. If names are being made up, Teresia was top of mind, and we know that there's a requirement to provide clues when lying. The Teresia Numgasa Palace was started in 1871 and completed in 1878, in the same time frame. Vienna was the home of the Austrian Rothschilds. One of these was named by Condor as part of the gossip. Once this charge of illegitimacy had been planted, the international press had a free hand to speculate on the paternity of Alois Hitler. One of the most outrageous of their libels was the charge that Alois Hitler was the illegitimate son of Baron Anselm Salomon de Rothschild of Vienna. The reason behind the Rothschild slur was obvious, since National Socialist policy called for ridding Germany of its Jewish Marxist menace. Rothschild was a well-known womanizing Viennese Jew, and the international press was largely controlled by Jewish interest. So that doesn't make any sense. If the international press is controlled by Jewish interest, why would they be implicating Rothschild? Because that's more a slur on him than it is on Alois Hitler, right? Why would the Allies care if Hitler was a secret Rothschild and had released his half-cousin from prison, Louis Nathaniel de Rothschild, because they would both have had the same grandfather of Anselm Salomon? Those who would care passionately about whether Hitler had released his half-cousin, a Rothschild, would be the Germans, because they'd be looking at whether they had been betrayed. One of the sources looks at Chancellor Dollfuss of Austria, who was said to have had the Austrian police do an investigation and find this genealogy of Maria Schicklgruber working in Vienna in the home of the Rothschilds. It's said that Adolf Hitler then initiated events and made it so that Dollfuss was assassinated, but failed to get his hands on that documentation, which was still secreted off to someone else. The person who wrote the book in 1940 that was exposing this was a high-level Gestapo officer. Let's look at the Rothschild named by the rulers, Anselm Salomon. He would have been 34 at the time of Alois's birth, so definitely a contender. But his father was 63, so also a contender for rapist. He has his birthplace listed as the Free City of Frankfurt, Holy Roman Empire, which seems a little odd, but that would make him a Frankenberger, as a person who resided in the city of Frankfurt. 2 years before Alois gets his windfall of 230 gulden, Anselm dies. So that seems like kind of fishy timing to me. And then I have the photographs of the different Rothschilds and Alois to see whether you can see a resemblance in those cold dead fish eyes. Back to Alois, who is now 230 gulden richer with a name change. That means he has to explain to his father-in-law, his wealthy wife, his employer, that he was really illegitimate, which seems much messier than letting sleeping dogmas lie. Maybe this change was initiated for his potential Rothschild half-brother, who is still living, and that is Albert Salomon Anselm Freiherr de Rothschild. Is it creepy that they all use Freeman just to emphasize that they are and we're not? Maybe the payoff was due to Nepomuk's money grubbing and threats to reveal the truth. It could have been contingent on putting the rumors to rest through testifying that George had claimed Alois as his son, and changing the name so Schicklgruber couldn't be traced back to that pesky maid who disappeared. Along with the windfall and name change, 1976 was a busy year for Alois. His wealthy wife Anna is now 53 and suffering with tuberculosis. Fanny, the maid he's fucking, is now 15. Nepomuk sends his 16-year-old granddaughter, Clara, into that lion's den to be another maid to Alois. Alois had lived with Clara's mother when he was 9 and she was 17 at Nepomuk's house. If Nepomuk is the father of Alois, Clara is his niece. If George is his father, Clara is his first cousin. If Anselm is his father, then he's just following in his philandering footsteps. Fanny, seeing the writing on the wall, demands that Alois send Clara away. Anna separates from Alois in 1880, although they remain married. Fanny has Alois Jr. At the age of 21. Anna dies next April. Fanny and Alois marry in May, and their next baby is born in July. Then Fanny gets tuberculosis, and as Condor gushes, Alois spares no expense. He moves Fanny and her mother, who'd been living with them and taking care of the 2 infants, out into the fresh air of a country clinic. This, of course, necessitates moving Clara back in to take care of the kids and Alois. Fanny dies on August 10th, 1884, at 23 years old, and 24-year-old Clara has Gustav on May 17th, 9 months and 1 week later. The 47-year-old Alois wants to marry Clara immediately when Fanny dies, but is prevented by incest laws due to that pesky affidavit. He applies to the church for a humanitarian waiver, and the priest sends it to the bishop, who sends it to Rome, saying, "The bridegroom has been a widower since August 10th of this year, as can be observed from the enclosed death certificate, and he is the father of 2 minors, a boy of 2.5, Alois, and a girl of 1 year and 2 months, Angela, and they both need the services of a nurse, all the more because he is a customs official away from home all day and often at night, and therefore in no position to supervise the education and upbringing of his children." I didn't know that customs officials had to work at night. "The bride has been caring for these children ever since their mother's death, and they are very fond of her. Thus it may be justifiably assumed that they will be well brought up, and the marriage will be a happy one. Moreover, the bride is without means, and it is unlikely that she will ever have another opportunity to make a good marriage. For these reasons, the undersigned repeat their humble petition for a gracious procurement of dispensation for the impediment of affinity." This is signed October 27th, when Clara is already 2 months pregnant. Rome gives the go-ahead. In January, they have a brief morning ceremony and a meal with the witnesses. Then Alois goes to work the same day. For the rest of their lives, she calls him uncle and he calls her niece. Can this get any creepier? 1 year after having Gustav, Clara has Ida. The next year she has Otto, who dies soon after. The next year, diphtheria kills both Ida and Gustav. A hard time for Clara, but things are going much better for Alois, because he purchases a small farm for the sizable sum of 4,000 to 5,000 gulden, 6 months after his uncle Nepomuk's death in 1888. If a gulden has the same value that it did in his mother's day, that's enough to buy several inns, so a very nice farm, although they don't live there. Why does Nepomuk leave this money to him and not his 3 daughters? And where did Nepomuk get this kind of money? It seems very suspicious. In 1889, Clara has Adolf, who is a sickly child. Alois hangs out in the tavern or with his bees when he's not working. Clara has another child, Edmund, who dies of measles at 5. The youngest, Paula, survives. So she raises 2 children she didn't bear, births 4 children she didn't get to raise, and raises 2 of her own. A hard life. What researchers say about Alois and Adolf. Alois was an authoritarian, overbearing, domineering husband and a stern, masterful, and often irritable father, and a strict, short-tempered patriarch who demanded unquestioning respect and obedience from his children and used the switch whenever his expectations were not met. Adolf feared his strict father, a hard and difficult man. This sour, hot-tempered man was master inside his home, where he made the children feel the lash of his cane, switch, and belt. Alois snarled at his son, humiliated him, and corrected him again and again. Even one of his closest friends admitted that Alois was awfully rough with his wife Clara, and hardly ever spoke a word to her at home. If Alois was in a bad mood, he picked on the older children or Clara in front of them. Hitler later wrote, after reading one day in Karl May, a popular children's book, that the brave man gives no sign of being in pain, I made up my mind not to let any sound next time I was beaten. And when the moment came, I counted every blow. Afterwards, he proudly told his mother, "Father hit me 32 times, and I did not cry." Hitler later said, "I never loved my father, but I feared him. He was prone to rages and would resort to violence. My poor mother would then always be afraid for me." Hitler also found it very distressing to see his mother suffering from drunken beatings. His sister Paula said, "It was especially my brother Adolf who challenged my father to extreme harshness and who got sound thrashings every day." So after reading everything that I can find, here's what rings false and true to me. George was not the father of Alois. It just doesn't make sense that he wouldn't be claiming him during his lifetime, especially when he marries Maria. Maybe Nepomuk is the father. That would be in character for him and would explain things like giving him all that money and making sure that he has the name without admitting that he had the affair while he was married with 3 kids. Or Nepomuk found someone to extort. Alois is his favorite because he makes him money. Alois thinks he's better than everybody else because he comes from money, but he's bitter because he doesn't get his share of it. And he can't tell people. The condition of his payoff is that he changes his name and never talks about it. Alois's son by Fanny, Alois Jr., ends up in prison for theft. His son, William Patrick Hitler, tries to extort Adolf with the Frankenberger letter showing he had Jewish blood. Both rotten apples fall close to the Alois tree. The story of Adolf's childhood convinces me that he would never knowingly be Rothschild's agent. He rejected his father's threats and enticements to become like him, and was a defender of his mother. He had the insight and intelligence to understand how money and power corrupt, and he'd pushed back hard against both. Maybe Adolf had direct knowledge of the Rothschild entitlement. If his grandmother had worked as a maid for Anselm Salomon, Anselm would have seen it as his right to have sex with her, just as Alois did with 12-year-old Fanny and 16-year-old Clara. The Rothschild maids would be Germans, not Jews. Use of German servants for sex was so common that Germany passed a law that Jews couldn't hire women under 45 as domestic workers. So it is not out of the question. This would have created the potential for blackmail. And the photos of Adolf in England by the Tavistock Institute, where MK Ultra practiced mind control, are intriguing. So is the later companion known to be an Allied asset, but the certain Rothschild agents are General Hindenburg, who became president, and General Ludendorff. Both were warmongers loyal to Rothschild and furious at the Kaiser Wilhelm peace offer. Hindenburg accepted 3 million Reichsmarks from moneyed industrialists to appoint Adolf as Reichskanzler. Ludendorff groomed him, coached him, and had him infiltrate the German Workers' Party. Ludendorff also made sure Lenin was escorted through Germany to infiltrate Russia. So maybe Hitler didn't sabotage the Fader economic plan. Maybe Hindenburg and Ludendorff sabotaged Hitler. Then I end with some quotes regarding a 2022 interview of Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. And he was asked, how is it possible that Ukraine could be Nazified when Zelensky is a Jew? Lavrov replied, Zelensky puts forward an argument. What kind of Nazism can they have if he is a Jew? I may be wrong, but Hitler also had Jewish blood. It means absolutely nothing. The wise Jewish people say that the most ardent anti-Semites are usually Jews. The family has its black sheep, as we say. The head of the Israeli Foreign Ministry demanded an apology, saying Lavrov's remarks are both unforgivable and outrageous, as well as a terrible historical error. Jews did not murder themselves in the Holocaust. The lowest level of racism against Jews is to accuse Jews themselves of anti-Semitism. Zelensky's public statement said, these words mean that Russia's top diplomat puts the blame on the Jewish people for Nazi crimes. I have no words. He continues, it is no coincidence that they are waging a so-called total war to destroy all living things, after which only the burned ruins of entire cities and villages remain. Such an anti-Semitic attack by their minister means that Russian authorities have forgotten all the lessons of World War II, or maybe they never learnt those lessons. The words of the Russian foreign minister, a great connoisseur of Hitlerism, are not random. 24 Jewish Democratic representatives issued their statement, defaulting to anti-Semitic tropes, including blaming the Jews for the Holocaust and using the Holocaust to cover their own war crimes, reflects the gutless depravity of the Russian regime. Lavrov's remarks on Italian TV were an affront to the memory of the 6 million Jews murdered by the Nazis, the survivors of the Holocaust, their families, and the entire world Jewish community. Representative Steve Cohen added that Lavrov and Russia were clearly disconnected from reality, morality, humanity, and sensitivity. This level of depravity is consistent with the reprehensible, repugnant, and reptilian conduct of Putin's government. So with that much of a smoke screen, how can there be no fire? For more on the falsification of history, here is The Myth of A.D. on Anno Domini by Laurent Guillenot. And for more on the Hitler question, here is Was Schicklgruber an actor playing Hitler? Thank you for watching.